Housing Roundup number 13. More Dakka by Showitz, April 6, 2026. Build more housing where people want to live. The rest is commentary. If there is enough housing, it will be affordable. People will afford more house, and people will be able to live where they want to live. It's always been that simple. Increased supply of any kind of housing increases affordability of all kinds of housing. Are there other things that would also be helpful? Yes, but they're commentary. Freeing up existing underused housing, for example, is helpful. It is commentary. Let's enjoy the lull and see how much of an infrastructure week we can do. New levels of saying quiet, part out loud. Even for this guy, Trump opposes building houses where people want to live because doing so would let people live there, which would drive down the value of existing homes.
Sin. Trump, I don't want to drive housing prices down. I want to drive housing prices up for people who own their homes. You can be sure that will happen.
Unusual whales. Trump, when you make it too easy and cheap to build houses, house prices come down. I don't want to do that.
Mike Solana, really dumb and bad.
Zach Hill, this is truly one of the most cardiac arrest-inducing quotes in an affordability era.
Classical liberal caucus, the left, building more housing won't make it cheaper. The right, yes, it will, and that's bad.
I take the bold stance that building more housing makes it cheaper, and that's good. Anytime you are wondering about Trump's relationship to affordability, know that where it counts, he has taken a bold stance, and that he is explicitly against it. This isn't even typically true since the value of the associated land goes up.
Alex Stapp. This is such a common fallacy. When you change the law to make it legal to build more homes on the same plot of land, the value of the land goes up while the per-unit price of housing goes down. Homeowners usually own both land and structures.
Whose side are you on?
Robot beat. I actually really appreciate Trump making this political dynamic explicit.
Boring business. One of the most significant moments from the Trump Davos speech was when he said the quiet part out loud. You cannot lower housing costs for young people without destroying millions in wealth for boomers. Every time you make it more affordable for somebody to own a house cheaply, you are actually hurting the value of those houses. I don't want to do anything to hurt the value of their house. If I wanted to crush the housing market, I could do that so fast that people could buy houses. But you would destroy people who already have houses. Our politicians are sacrificing people in their 20s and 30s for the prosperity of boomers. Let that sink in.
Your intervention only partly solves the problem, so we are against it. Trump is against building more housing because it might reduce housing prices. Julie Weil reports that supply skeptics oppose building housing where people want to live because it would not reduce prices by enough to fully take care of our inequality problems, so that's no way to fix affordability. As in, and this is the argument they choose to make here, if we built enough to grow housing stock by 1.5% a year, which in the grand scheme does not sound like much but is these days remarkably hard, then that might cause housing prices to only decline 4% per year, so it would take 18 years before a median one-bedroom apartment becomes affordable for a worker in San Francisco. I notice I am confused how this is an objection. Their other complaint is that the housing being built is too useful and in demand, and thus will cost too much money, and therefore it should be worse instead. More Dakka. A study finds that if you modestly more housing, you only modestly reduce prices. Specifically, if San Francisco increased market rate housing by 1.5% per year, which it notes is more than triple the current rate, it would take 124 years to make the median one-bedroom affordable to someone earning the median wage for non-college graduates. That's a bizarre standard. Why should a single non-graduate be able to live alone in San Francisco proper, one of the most desirable places on earth? But if you want that, you're going to need to expand the housing stock more than 27%. Could you do that? Very obviously you could do that. You could build 30-story buildings all over the place if you wanted to. Austin proves you can do it. But that's not going to happen in San Francisco until both zoning and other government-imposed costs and veto points are handled. As usual, if someone argues, you could double the housing stock and prices would not come down. The response is, that's not how it works, but if it was, then that sounds amazing. Think how much value you would be creating. Abundance.
Matthew Iglesias. There are a lot of regulations curtailing air pollution. If we repeal those regs, then corporations will generate abundant air pollution. This is bad because air pollution is bad. If we repeal regs that curtail housing production, corporations will generate housing.
Spirangelos. Abundance versus antitrust discourse occurs with such regularity and ferocity because it reflects the internal power struggles of the Democratic Party and the bureaucracy, not because the actual issues they identify are the most center.
Douglas Farrar. True. The fundamental questions are, 1. If Dems repeal regulations, will a handful of large corporations deliver abundance across markets? 2. Will it be politically popular for Dems to make removing regulations to help billionaires and large corporations the top priority?
Changes in rent are largely about changes in supply. Guess what the places with the largest drops have in common? This is year over year.
Image. The image is a table titled, "In high-supplied markets, Class C rents are plunging," ranking 17 U.S. metro areas by year-over-year Class C rent declines. It lists each market's percent rent change, from about 13.9% to 6.3%, alongside whether the area's apartment supply growth is above the U.S. average, which is marked yes for nearly all entries.
And guess what the places with the largest growth in rents?
Image. The image shows a table titled, "In low-supplied markets, Class C rent still rising," ranking 20 U.S. markets by year-over-year Class C rent change, from Springfield, MA, 10.1%, down to Stockton, CA, 3.1%. A final column indicates whether each market's apartment supply expansion is above the U.S. average, with nearly all marked no and only Trenton, NJ marked yes.
Or
Image. The image is a bar chart comparing major U.S. rental markets by 5-year average growth in new apartment units and the percent change in rents since their peak. It shows that cities with higher construction growth, such as Austin, Nashville, and Charlotte, tend to have larger rent declines, while the U.S. average and several lower growth cities show smaller drops.
Austin. Austin is a large outlier in terms of population growth versus rent growth. It turns out all you have to do is build even more housing.
Image. The image is a scatterplot titled, "Population Growth and Rent Inflation," comparing U.S. metro areas, with population growth, 2015 to 2023, on the x-axis and rent change, 2015 to 2023, on the y-axis, plus a dotted upward trend line. Austin is highlighted with a red circle and appears far to the right, high population growth, but relatively low on the y-axis compared with peers, more modest rent increases. Image. The image is a line chart titled, "Austin, TX, Rental Market Correction," showing apartment asking rents from 2017 to 2025, rising gradually before a sharp surge in 2021 to 2022 to a peak around $1,636. It then shows a sustained drop from about August 2022 onward, highlighted as an 18% decline, bringing rents down into the mid-$1,300s by 2024 to 2025.
Mike Fellman argues that Austin could only build so much because of rising rents as opposed to high absolute rents, because the model requires building appreciation. Except this makes absolutely no sense because the cost of construction is distinct from the value of the constructed building, or at least those things are highly distinct in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York, where housing is extremely valuable, but you have trouble getting permission to build it. If you allow building housing, then yes, you should expect the two to converge, at which point it only makes sense to build more housing if you expect appreciation. And yes, this helps explain why Austin may have actively overbuilt, although my guess is it at most got ahead of itself a bit. America.
Peter Wildford. I wonder why population is moving south, and the South is getting more electoral votes. Thinking face emoji.
Hunter, the South is currently building more apartments than every other region of the U.S. combined.
Image. The image is a U.S. map titled Regional Breakdown of U.S. Apartment Construction in 2025, shading each region and labeling estimated units. South 265,613, West 125,629, Midwest 58,590, and Northeast 56,521. It also highlights metro totals for New York, 30,023, Dallas, 28,958, Austin, 26,715, Phoenix, 21,188, Atlanta, 17,512. Noting the figures are estimates.
Veronica Grecu. New apartment construction in the U.S. is flexing its muscle again in 2025, with an estimated 506,353 units expected to be opened nationwide by the end of the year.
Image. The image is a bar chart titled U.S. New Apartment Deliveries by Year, showing annual unit deliveries from 2016 to 2025, with values rising from about 352,000 in 2016 to a peak of 640,000 in 2024 and 506,000 in 2025. A horizontal reference line marks the 10-year average annual supply at 439,000 units, with 2022 highlighted at 403,000.
New York Metro includes a wide area and places like Hackensack and Yonkers. Brooklyn is delivering 7,189 units, Manhattan 4,662, and Queens 2,630, versus 15,195 for Austin and 12,365 for Charlotte. Minnesota. A new paper by Helena Gu and David Monroe claims that 5 years after the Minneapolis 2040 plan, home prices were 16% to 34% lower, and rents were 17.5% to 34% lower versus a counterfactual Minneapolis without that reform, P equals 0.012. But as much as I want to believe this worked amazingly well, and that there aren't any other reasons driving this, the housing hasn't been built yet.
We explore the possible mechanism of these impacts and find that the reform did not trigger a construction boom or an immediate increase in the housing supply. Instead, the observed price reductions appear to stem from a softening of housing demand, likely driven by altered expectations about the housing market.
I get why purchase prices go down anticipating future supply, but rents shouldn't do the same and should rise relative to purchase prices. So why didn't that happen? I can come up with some just-so stories that try to explain some of the fall in rents due to anticipatory and longer-term impacts of rentals, but rents falling fully in line with sale prices seems like it has to be wrong. If it's right, the market is being highly irrational. Debunking obvious nonsense about monopolistic practices. I sometimes worry I am pushing the envelope on how obviously something has to be nonsense before it counts as obvious nonsense. This is not one of those times.
Derek Thompson. In housing, for example, Ezra Klein and I write that a key bottleneck to home building in the last few decades has been legal barriers to construction, including zoning laws and minimum lot sizes. This is a mainstream view supported by economists and scholars who have studied the issue for decades. The antitrust left, however, claims that the more significant factor is that big home builders abuse their power by holding back construction to juice their profits. Big home builders withhold housing supply, the antitrust advocate Matt Stoller has claimed. In their paper, Post-Neoliberal Housing Policy, the law professors Christopher Sirkin and Ganesh Sitaraman criticize market concentration in home building and call for tools from anti-monopoly policy.
The position that the primary problem is monopolies, or at least oligopolies, has never made any sense. Even if it theoretically did make sense and was a substantial driver holding back construction, zoning reform would allow for entry, as the mechanism to enforce the oligopoly is difficulty getting permission to build.
At a high level, I have never found these arguments persuasive. One hallmark of a monopolistic market is rising profits, but researchers have found that developer profits have remained steady.
If zoning imposes artificial supply restrictions, then profits could rise via a similar mechanism that way, which I presume is not happening, because instead we build in increasingly convoluted ways while paying various massive de facto bribes to various veto points. But if profits are not rising, that rules out monopolistic supply restrictions. In any case, Thompson decides to engage with one prominent article in particular.
In Messing with Texas, How Big Homebuilders and Private Equity Made American Cities Unaffordable, Musharbash writes that housing in the Dallas metro, like many other cities, has become much more expensive in the last few years. I'm not an economist or a lawyer. I'm just a journalist. To the extent that I'm good at anything, it's calling people on the phone and writing down what they say. So I reached out to the primary sources that Musharbash quotes throughout the piece. What I found was astonishing. The economist Musharbash cites told me that his theories had been misapplied. The housing analysts quoted in the piece told me Musharbash distorted their points and reached dubious, or even flatly wrong, conclusions. The leading monopoly researcher I spoke to, whose work has been celebrated by the antitrust left, told me that the entire thrust of the article, and, by extension, much of the antitrust housing philosophy, defied sophisticated antitrust analysis. The essay you're reading is very long, but I can sum it up in one sentence. The Musharbash essay on Dallas, like too much of the antitrust left's work on housing, is filled with out-of-context quotes, overconfident assertions lacking evidence, and generally misguided claims. Now let's go through them one by one.
I dispute one of Thompson's claims. His essay is not that long. Well, at least not by my standards, but it is too long to quote that much of it, so we'll hit the highlights.
Claim number 1. Dallas is a home builder oligopoly. Reality. I called the key oligopoly researcher cited in the Musharbash essay. He disagreed with the use of his work and told me that any city with Dallas's construction record was 100% not an oligopoly. I called Luis Quintero to ask what level of market concentration in home building he considered to be dangerous. In the most concentrated markets, Quintero said, 1 or 2 firms account for 90% of new housing. But problems begin to accelerate, he said, if 5 or 6 firms account for 90% of new housing. I immediately saw a problem. In Dallas, the top 2 firms built just 30% of new homes in 2023. The top 6 firms barely account for 50% of new housing. Musharbash's claim that a home-building oligopoly is crushing housing supply in Dallas relies on an economic analysis that doesn't apply to Dallas at all. I asked Quintero about this. Would you agree that Dallas is a bad application of your paper? I would definitely agree, Quintero told me. I tracked down a complete listing of the country's 50 largest home-building markets, from number 1 Dallas to number 50 Cincinnati. How many meet Quintero's first oligopoly threshold? 2 companies equals 90% of the market, 0 out of 50. And how many meet his second threshold? 6 companies equals 90% of the market, 1 Cincinnati.
There is then further discussion with Quintero, who defends his original, very different claim that oligopolies in housing construction matter by pointing to impact on suburbs or small towns with higher concentration.
Claim number 2. Dallas housing experts say local homebuilders are monopolies who are devouring the market.
Reality. When I called up a Dallas housing expert John McManus cited several times in Musharbash's essay, he disagreed profoundly with its thesis. He's actually a big yimbai.
So what did McManus think was more responsible for driving up the cost of housing in Dallas? Land use regulation, he said. Zoning? I asked. Yes, land constraints and zoning that require certain footage along the street, or minimum lot sizes, or requirements about 3-car garages are more the cause of the prices increasing now, he said. We're already approaching stop, he's already dead territory, but we keep going.
Claim number 3. Industry experts have data proving that home-building oligopolies are holding back national housing construction. Reality. I reached out to an industry expert whom the antitrust folks like to quote. He told me that he disagreed with the way that his analysis is being used by Musharbash, Stoller, and other antitrust advocates. Claim number 4. X companies account for Y% of this industry is a smart way to think about market concentration. Reality. A leading monopoly researcher told me this is an incomplete and overly simplistic way to think about monopoly power. Like Lambert, Robert said he couldn't rule out the possibility that larger home builders are actually good for the housing market, or even that today's home building markets would benefit from being even more concentrated.
So often we run into situations like this, where there is an obvious nonsense theory that never made any sense even under ideal conditions, and then you find out that even on its own terms it makes no sense, and conditions are not only not remotely ideal, they don't match up to the claims at all. One can also look at the following simpler argument. 1. The argument from Monopoly agrees that the primary problem is not enough housing where people want to live, and the issue is lack of construction. 2. Home builders keep constantly fighting to build more housing than they are allowed to build. 3. When we let them build more housing, they reliably build more. 4. We're done here, right? A group can't simultaneously be restricting supply and also fighting to create as much supply as it can. It doesn't make sense. Stop it. At this point, one would like to invoke, stop, he's already dead, but, well...
Matt Stoller. Okay, so I'm going to call out Derek Thompson for journalistic malpractice and unethical behavior. He wrote a piece that was supposedly debunking something that antitrust lawyer Basil Musharbash put together on how Wall Street limits housing supply. Derek Thompson attacked the piece. Here's what he said on Blue Sky.
I did something really simple. I called up their sources. Everyone I spoke to told me the same thing. Their claims are bullshit.
Wow, that sounds bad. So I picked up the phone.
Stoller goes on to claim that Thompson misrepresented the arguments in the original article when calling his sources, in particular Lance Lambert, and calls out Thompson as being in bad faith. Then, of course, Derek Thompson picked up the phone again, called Lance again, and says he got Lance to sign off on every quote and all the language, and got Lance to say he agrees with Derek's position, and that home builders are not a cartel or oligopoly, and in particular, I hope you both communicate my view that I don't think the big builders are bad actors or even that they have the power to be the bad actors. And indeed, we have a response from Lance that both of them posted, in which Lance affirms that Derek is correct and affirms that there is no one holding back supply. Various people, including Matt, tried to present this as a balanced perspective or as backing Matt. I do think Lance's response is balanced and very good, but in a way that, in the most polite way possible, completely vindicates Derek. Matt attempted to go after Derek personally up to and including accusing him of malpractice and unethical behavior and calling for The Atlantic to look over his past work. That itself is highly unethical behavior in this context. Eric Levitz has an unnecessary but highly robust takedown here. Age of the median homebuyer. Claims went around that the median home buyer was 59 years old. What? Does it make any sense that the median home buyer could be 59? Really? The real answer is closer to 40, which makes more sense and seems entirely fine.
Connor O'Brien, the National Association of Realtors, says the age of the median home buyer is now 59. Is that actually true? In the American Community Survey, the median age of heads of households who are 1, homeowners, and 2, moved in within the last year is 41.
Image. The image is a line chart titled Median Age of Homebuyers in the American Community Survey, showing the median age of recent homebuyers from 2000 to 2023. The line fluctuates mostly in the high 30s to low 40s, rising to around 42 in the mid-2010s and ending near 41.
The American Housing Survey also doesn't show a major run-up in the median age of average buyers or the median age of first-time home buyers.
Image. The image is a line chart titled Chart 3, First-Time Home Buyers Are Younger, showing ages from 2001 to 2021 for 3 groups. New home buyers, blue, first-time buyers, red, and all buyers, gray dashed. New home buyer ages rise into the mid-40s by the late 2010s, while first-time buyers stay around 30-33, and all buyers trend upward from the high 30s to about 41.
This is average, not median age, but the New York Fed finds that first-time homebuyers were younger in 2024 than in the 2000s. Haven't gotten older on average in nearly 20 years.
Image. The image is a line chart titled Average Age at Time of Home Purchase, showing trends from 2000 to 2024 for first-time buyers, blue, and repeat buyers, red. The repeat buyer average age rises from the mid-40s to about 48-49, while the first-time buyer average age stays relatively flat around 35-37.
As my colleague has pointed out, Gen Z and millennials have taken longer to achieve the same home ownership rates than prior generations. Home ownership is indeed less common for young people than it used to be. Just isn't nearly as dire as NAR implies. New York Fed Consumer Credit Panel data from Equifax, which excludes all cash buyers, TBF, finds that a majority of home buyers were first-time buyers in 2023. Overall volumes are down since the early 2000s, of course. Median 2024 homebuyer in the Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making, age 39. A Zillow national survey of 20,000 homebuyers finds that the median buyer among all buyers, not just first-time buyers, is 42 years old. The survey was in the field between April and September 2025. We also have this survey showing a sharp rise in first-time buyer age after 2020, with the obvious reason being interest rates. But as Sendikta points out that HUD and Fannie/Freddie define first-time homebuyer as not having ownership in a primary residence for 3 years prior. So this is picking up a bunch of not first-time buyers in its averages, who might have rented for a few years and then bought back in due to COVID dynamics.
Image. The image is a line chart titled Age of U.S. First-Time Homebuyers Surges to Record, showing the median age of first-time homebuyers from the early 1980s through the mid-2020s. The line stays around the high 20s to low 30s for decades, then rises sharply after about 2020 to roughly 40, with a note attributing the trend to high prices and mortgage rates.
Property taxes improve allocation efficiency, whereas we often do the opposite via capital gains tax implications of selling, which provides strong incentives to stay put in too much house.
Bernard Stanford. A retired empty nester couple feeling pressure to downsize because their property tax keeps rising as their home appreciates is exactly how the system should work.
Hunter. People absolutely hate this, but it's true. It's just way better and more important for society for a young couple to be able to buy a larger house and start a family than it is to prioritize older owners hanging on to huge homes they no longer need. Memories be damned.
Matthew Iglesias. It would really be good if more empty nester couples living in large homes in desirable suburbs would realize their capital gains and downsize to smaller dwellings. But almost every jurisdiction gives special property tax breaks to discourage this. Apartment buildings with elevators, less square footage to clean, no yard work, professional maintenance, etc. seem ideal for America's growing senior citizen population, and you'd free up inventory for young families who will actually use the space.
If an old couple values the memories or other advantages of staying put, such that they are the efficient owners of the space, they should be willing to pay the associated property taxes. If they can't or won't, that means they either don't actually value the house as much as the market does, are effectively living beyond their means, or both, and often this will mostly be due to inertia. Property taxes also serve to lower the market value of housing, so the higher taxes don't make it harder for new homeowners to buy. Indeed, they may do the opposite and are highly progressive and a badly needed transfer to those starting out in life. The instinct against this is the idea that you should be able to own real property free and clear, and what's yours is yours, without being forced to engage with any market. And rising property values shouldn't effectively be able to force you out if you want to stay. I do totally get that attitude, but I don't think we get that luxury. Ideally, of course, we would instead have a tax on the unimproved value of land. Another big advantage of higher property taxes is that it protects against people wanting their property values to rise. This will make them more willing to build new housing. The downside is that property taxes apply to newly built property and the appreciation in value, so it discourages building. Ideally, you would approximate the unimproved value of land rule by only taxing appreciation from construction or new buildings after a reasonably long period. But yes, you have to strike a balance here. In exchange for the higher property taxes, we should eliminate capital gains taxes on home sales for primary residences up to some reasonable limit, which further encourages people not to stick with existing homes. More of old people inefficiently and systematically stealing from young people. In case you were worried young people might ever own real property, or as Mark calls it, without even putting poor in air quotes.
Mark Goldwine, more tax breaks for poor seniors.
This is New Jersey giving those 65 and older a credit for 50% of their property tax bill, up to $6,500, as long as they have a total income of under $500,000. Income, not wealth, while they are over 65. No, they're not kidding.
This has been an episode of the Don't Worry About the Vase podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit thezv.substack.com to support the author. If you enjoy having AI-narrated episodes, please note this is a listener-supported podcast. To receive new posts and support the cost of creation, consider becoming a subscriber at dwatvpodcast.substack.com. Thanks for listening.